A bitter wind sweeps across the frozen plains of the Baltic, rattling the banners that still cling to the blood-stained walls of a fortress on the brink of annihilation. The once proud stronghold of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, one of the last great Christian warrior orders in the north, now stands alone, surrounded on all sides by an army that outnumbers them 10 to 1. The Teutonic Knights had their fortresses. The Templars had their castles in the Holy Land. But here, in the wild, untamed lands of the Baltic, this was the last bastion of faith standing against an unstoppable tide. It is a place where the cold wind howls like a vengeful spirit, biting at exposed skin, reminding every soul present that winter here spares no one. Snowdrifts pile against the ramparts, and icicles cling to broken beams, turning each corner of the fortress into a treacherous obstacle. The horses whinny in fear, their breath visible in the frigid air. Soldiers cough into their cloaks, desperately trying to keep warm as they grip swords with numb fingers. The year is 1236, and the world has turned against them. Word travels slowly through these inhospitable lands, yet rumors of the fortress's predicament have spread like wildfire among the locals. Many peasants in distant villages can only pray from afar, fearful that if this bastion falls, no place in Livonia or beyond will remain safe. Everywhere, tension hangs like a thick fog, and across the plains, scattered encampments of pagan warriors prepare themselves for the final push, confident that victory is close at hand. For decades, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword had been the sharp edge of Christian expansion into the pagan lands of the north, fighting in the name of the Pope and the Holy Roman Empire. Their mission was as much about faith as it was about land, establishing outposts of Christendom in territories where ancient gods and nature spirits held sway. They built monasteries, introduced new laws, and clashed in constant skirmishes with local tribes, forging a hard-earned respect from allies and a deep, simmering hatred from foes. But now, the pagans were no longer the ones retreating. United under the legendary leader Mindaugas of Lithuania and bolstered by the wrath of the surrounding Baltic tribes, the tide had turned. One by one, the Christian strongholds in Livonia fell. Now, the last of the Livonian Brothers, warriors clad in white surcoats with crimson swords emblazoned across their chests, stood as the final line against oblivion. Each man knew, deep within his heart, that there would be no reinforcements, no sudden rescue from some distant duke or king. The only support they had was each other. Inside the fortress, the air was thick with the scent of sweat, steel, and blood. The knights knew what was coming. They had seen the fate of those who surrendered. The Baltic tribes did not take prisoners. If the walls fell, there would be no mercy. The corridors echoed with the groans of the wounded, huddled in corners where makeshift bandages soaked through with crimson. Torches sputtered along the passageways, casting flickering shadows that danced like specters. Younger squires shuffled nervously, trying to brace themselves for a final confrontation. In the courtyard, a handful of war horses remained, stamping their hooves and snorting as if sensing the end. Every face bore an expression of grim determination, a silent acceptance that they would all either stand or die together. The Grand Master of the Order, Volkwin von Winterstedt, gathered what remained of his men in the courtyard. Their armor was dented, their swords chipped, their shields splintered, but their spirit was unbroken. Even as the wind whipped through the fortress walls, blowing snow into their faces, these men stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a tight semicircle around the Grand Master. Their breaths formed plumes of vapor in the icy air, but no one shivered now. Adrenaline and sheer willpower were all that kept them upright. "Brothers, we are outnumbered. We are surrounded. But we are not afraid," he declared, his voice steady despite the weight of impending doom pressing upon them. "We have taken our vows. We swore to fight for Christendom, and we shall fight until our last breath. Let them come." The wind seemed to drop for a moment, as if pausing to listen. Behind von Winterstedt, the fortress gate stood scarred from previous assaults, its wooden beams scorched and nearly broken, but still standing against all odds. Overhead, the sky was gray and oppressive, threatening another flurry of snowfall. Yet the men's faces lit with a fire of their own, a reflection of their unwavering devotion. A roar of defiance rose from the warriors, their voices carrying over the walls into the night. If they were to die, they would die with swords in hand and prayers on their lips. Some of the knights clashed their blades against their dented shields in a rhythmic beat, forging a harsh, metallic chant that resonated through the stone corridors. A few even pressed their foreheads to their swords, whispering final devotions to saints or beseeching the Virgin Mary for a miracle. Those who had survived every previous battle recognized this moment as the final test of faith, one that would be carved into legend no matter the outcome. Then the storm began. Outside the fortress, the enemy made their move. The pagan forces, a coalition of Lithuanian warriors, Semi-Gallian raiders, and Samogitian cavalry, surged forward with a primal fury. Snow and ice crunched beneath their boots and horses' hooves, creating a thunderous rumble that echoed across the plains. The sky darkened with arrows, their flights whistling eerily before embedding in stone or flesh. The walls trembled under the weight of battering rams, each strike sending tremors through the knights' boots. Within the fortress, men exchanged quick glances, their hearts pounding as they realized the final assault had commenced. The Livonian brothers, though battered, refused to crumble. From the ramparts, they rained down death, their crossbows finding their marks with deadly precision. In the narrow corridors, they fought with the discipline of men who had trained their entire lives for this moment. Swords clashed, shields shattered, and the very ground became slick with blood. The air was thick with the screams of the dying and the war cries of the living. Through it all, torchlight flickered, illuminating the swirling chaos of combat. In some corners, one could see pairs or small groups of knights pinned against walls, battling multiple foes at once. Yet they never ceased to press forward or defend. They fought with an almost supernatural resolve, each man driven by the oath he had sworn, each believing wholeheartedly that their sacrifice served a higher purpose. But the enemy was relentless. For every warrior that fell, 10 more surged forward. The outer wall collapsed, the stone crumbling under ceaseless hammering, and the pagans poured through the breach like a river unleashed from a dam. One by one, the knights fell. Some died with swords still swinging, others were torn from their saddles, dragged into the seething mass of warriors, never to be seen again. The courtyard became a maelstrom of swirling snow and dust, kicked up by the thrashing of bodies locked in mortal combat. Even the darkest corners of the fortress provided no safety. The battle was everywhere, devouring every hallway, every chamber, every step. The stench of burning pitch and smoldering timber mixed with the metallic tang of blood, a nauseating reminder of the fortress's imminent fall. Volkwin von Winterstedt stood atop the final keep, his armor stained red, his sword slick with the blood of his foes. His breath came in ragged gasps, but he did not waver. The few remaining knights gathered around him, their backs to the stone, their shields locked together. This was the end, but it was an end worthy of legend. Flames crackled beneath them, licking at the edges of beams, and smoke drifted through the upper windows. The roar of combat below reached them like the roar of a distant sea. Yet in that moment, facing overwhelming odds, there was a profound calm in their eyes. They looked to their grandmaster for one final command. Then the gates of the keep burst open. The final charge was chaos incarnate. The last of the Livonian brothers fought with the desperation of men who knew there was no tomorrow. Every swing of their swords, every thrust of their spears was not to win, but to take as many of the enemy with them as they could. The clangor of steel on steel mixed with the howling of warriors. Bodies piled up at the threshold, hindering any easy movement. This forced the knights into brutal close quarters, where an errant blow or a well-aimed spear could decide a life in an instant. Yet in the face of certain doom, the brothers displayed an almost superhuman unity. Each small step they took forward was a testament to centuries of martial tradition, to a belief that some lines are never to be surrendered, even if it means sacrificing one's life. And then silence. When the smoke cleared and the torches finally burned out, the fortress was no more. The banners of the Livonian Brothers lay trampled in the dirt, the crimson swords on their surcoats soaked in blood. Not a single knight had surrendered. Not a single warrior had fled. They had died as they had lived, unyielding, unbroken, bound by honor until the very last breath. Dawn revealed a landscape of rubble and ash, corpses heaped around what little walls still stood, the snow stained pink by the rising sun's glow. Ravens circled overhead, drawn by the scent of carrion. A hush fell over the battlefield, as though the land itself mourned this savage end. The battle was over, but the legend had only just begun. The pagan warriors, victorious at a tremendous cost, paused to acknowledge the valor of the fallen. Even amid animosity, there was a respect for such fierce dedication, for men who refused to bend even when all hope was lost. Word of the Livonian Brothers' last stand spread with every returning raider, every merchant who came to see the ruins, carrying stories of extraordinary bravery to distant corners of Europe. For years to come, the story of the last stand of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword would be told across Europe. The Christian orders would rebuild, the Teutonic Knights would rise in their place, and the Crusades in the north would continue. But something had changed. The Baltic tribes had proven that they could resist. They had shown that even the mightiest of orders could fall. And in that realization, the seeds of a new future were sown. The grand strategies of popes and emperors would have to adapt to the reality that faith alone could not subdue an entire region, especially one so fierce in defending its independence. The Livonian Brothers were gone, but their defiance echoed through history. Their final stand was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a reckoning. In the lands where they had once marched, where their swords had once carved the path of conquest, the fires of independence now burned bright. Nations would remember this event when forging new alliances or deciding whether to kneel to foreign powers. And though the fortress lay in ruins, its story lived on in the whispered reverence of monks, the solemn sagas of pagans who overcame an empire's might, and the determined hearts of those who would carry on the struggle for freedom in the Baltic's frozen expanse. It was a single battle, a single day in the unrelenting march of history. Yet it reverberated far beyond the fortress walls, shaping legends of courage and sacrifice that would endure for centuries. And so, as the winter snows covered the fallen knights, their memory remained a testament to the unwavering power of conviction, an eternal flame blazing even in the deepest cold. They had lost the fortress, lost their lives, but in defiance, they had gained something else: immortality in the historical records of faith and war. And as travelers passed through the harsh Baltic roads and listened to the haunting tales of the Livonian Brothers' last stand, they might feel a chill not just of the weather, but of awe at how fiercely men could fight for a cause that transcended any single lifetime.